They found him kneeling, not collapsed, not fallen, kneeling, his body bent forward in prayer, his hands clasped, his forehead resting on his bed. He had been dead for hours. The rain drummed on the thatch roof of a mud hut in a village whose name you've never heard, in the heart of a continent, 1,500 miles from the nearest ocean. The world had declared him dead 2 years earlier. The newspapers had printed his obituary. His family had mourned him. And yet, here he was, or what was left of him, a skeleton held together by will and faith, weighing less than 90 pounds, his feet destroyed by tropical ulcers, his body hollowed by 33 bouts of malaria. The 2 African men who found him, Susie and Chuma, made a decision that night that would shock the world. They would not bury him there. They would carry him home. For 9 months, they carried his body 1,500 miles through hostile territory, facing tribes who believed a corpse brought curses, enduring starvation and disease, never once abandoning their master. When his body finally reached London, a doctor was called to identify the remains. He looked at the withered left arm and found what he was searching for: a badly healed fracture, the tooth marks still visible in the bone, 11 punctures from the jaws of a lion. "It is he," the doctor whispered and wept. But who was he? What kind of man dies on his knees in a place no map can find? What kind of man inspires such loyalty that 2 men will carry his corpse across a continent? The answer begins not in Africa, but in Scotland. Not in a palace, but in a factory. Not with the hero, but with a 10-year-old boy whose hands are stained with machine oil and whose ears ring with the deafening thunder of the spinning jennies. It begins with a vow made in a single room where 7 people sleep. A vow whispered by candlelight. A vow that will cost him his health, his family, his wife, and finally, his life. It begins with a book that should not have been there. This is the story of David Livingstone. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let me tell you how a mill boy became a martyr, how a failed preacher became a prophet, and how a man who lost everything found the one thing that mattered. The blantyre spark, the clatter of the spinning jenny, was the soundtrack of the boy's life, a deafening, relentless rhythm of iron and cotton. But in the sliver of space on the roaring machine, a book lay open, its pages trembling with the vibration. David's hands were mending threads, but his mind was 1,000 miles away. This was Blantyre, Scotland, in the year 1823. A village built on the banks of the River Clyde, a town defined by the massive stone cotton mill that rose like a fortress from the water's edge. Inside its walls, the air was a thick, white fog, a constant cloud of cotton dust that coated the throat and stung the eyes. The noise was a physical weight, a continuous, crashing thunder that shook the floorboards and rattled the windows, a sound so loud that men and women learned to speak without being heard, their lips moving in a silent language of nods and gestures. This was the world that formed 10-year-old David Livingstone. His day began before the sun at 6 in the morning. It ended long after the sun had set, at 8 in the evening. 14 hours of relentless, monotonous toil. He was a piecer. His job was to walk the long, oily alleys between the spinning mules, his bare feet pacing mile after mile on the wooden floors. His eyes scanned the hundreds of threads, and when one snapped, his small, nimble fingers would dart into the blur of machinery to catch the broken ends and twist them back together. It was dangerous work. A moment of fatigue, a second of lost focus, and the cold, iron teeth of the machines could crush a finger or a hand. He saw it happen, but David was not easily fatigued, and his focus was absolute. He was small for his age, but his frame held a resilience that baffled the older workers. He was quiet, he was watchful, and he was learning. On a small ledge of the spinning frame, he had propped a book. It was a Latin grammar, purchased with the very first wages he had ever earned. As his body paced the alley, as his hands mended the cotton, his mind wrestled with a different kind of thread. He learned verb conjugations to the rhythm of the crashing looms. He memorized vocabulary in the fleeting seconds between mended breaks. His masters, seeing this strange, quiet boy, did not rebuke him. They marveled. They saw hunger that the mill could not satisfy. His body was a servant to the machine, but his mind was free. His mind was preparing. When the final bell rang, its sound barely cutting through the din, he would walk out into the cool, damp night, his legs aching, his ears ringing with the phantom echo of the factory. Home was a single room at the top of a tenement building on Shuttle Row. The space was barely 14 feet by 10. It was a world contained in 4 short walls, a single small room for his father, his mother, his 2 brothers, and his 2 sisters. The air was thick with the smell of cooking and coal smoke, the space crowded with beds and chests. But it was a home of meticulous order and profound peace. His mother, Agnes, was a woman of gentle spirit and tireless energy. She kept that one small room immaculate. She was the quiet center of the family, a presence of calm and unconditional love. His father, Neil, was a different kind of force. Neil Livingstone was a man of deep, unbending conviction. He was a tea dealer by trade, walking miles each day, but his true calling was as a Sunday school teacher and a man of God. He was fiercely Protestant, a man who traced his lineage back to the Covenanters who had died for their faith. He brought his faith into that small room, not as a burden, but as the very air they breathed. Neil brought home books. In the evenings, by the light of a single flickering candle, he would read aloud. He read stories of theology, histories of the Scottish Church, and books on science and nature. He believed that faith and knowledge were twin pillars, that to study God's creation was an act of worship. He taught his children to despise hypocrisy, to value honesty, and to believe in the absolute, unwavering sovereignty of God. The family would gather, the noise of the village fading below them. The large family Bible would be opened, knees would bend on the cold floor, and the quiet words of evening prayer would rise, a fortress of faith against the hardship of their world. This was the foundation. This was the stone upon which David's life was being built. The 14-hour workday was done, but David's work was not. He would eat a simple meal of oatmeal, and then, while his siblings slept, he would walk back out into the night. From 8 o'clock until 10, he attended the school provided by the mill owners. He sat on a hard, wooden bench, his body heavy with exhaustion, his fingers still stained with machine oil. He sat beside other children, their faces pale and tired in the dim gaslight. But here, his mind would ignite. He pushed the weariness aside. He tackled mathematics. He wrestled with the complexities of Latin. His teachers saw the fire in him, this relentless, unquenchable thirst. It was a drive that came not from a desire for riches, but from a place much deeper. It was a holy curiosity, a belief that his mind was a tool given by God, and it was his duty to sharpen it. His father, Neil, was an active member of the local missionary society. He saved his pennies to support the cause, and he brought home pamphlets and letters from the field. There were stories of strange lands, of unreached peoples, of men who had left the comforts of Scotland to carry the gospel to the ends of the earth. David read them all. He read of India. He read of the islands of the sea. One evening, he read an appeal from a man named Karl Gutzlaff. The name was foreign, the place almost unimaginable, China. Gutzlaff was a medical missionary. He wrote of a land of millions, a people bound by ancient traditions who had never heard the name of Jesus. He wrote of his work as a doctor, how healing a person's physical ailments, a broken bone, a fever, a blind eye, could open a door into their hearts. It was a bridge of trust. It was compassion in action. David read the words again, and then again. A spark ignited in his chest. It was not a lightning bolt from heaven, not a voice in the room. It was a quiet, profound, and logical connection. This was it. This was the purpose of the long hours. This was the meaning of Latin. God could use a doctor. God could use his fascination with science, his love of nature, his steady hand. His study of creation was not a path away from faith, as his father sometimes feared, but the very path to his calling. In that small, crowded tenement room, with the distant rumble of the Clyde outside, 10-year-old David Livingstone made a quiet, private vow. He would become a doctor. He would go to China. He would dedicate his mind, his hands, and his life to the service of God. The spinning jenny still roared in his ears each morning. The cotton dust still filled his lungs. But the boy who walked the mill floor was no longer just a piece. He was a vessel, waiting to be filled, preparing for a journey he could not yet imagine. The spark had been lit, a tiny, steady flame of purpose that would, in God's time, light up a continent. The promise and the pivot. The anatomy lecture hall in Glasgow was a world away from the cotton mill. It smelled not of cotton dust and machine oil, but of chemicals, of carbolic acid, of cold, hard knowledge. David Livingstone sat on the steep wooden benches, his focus as singular on the human body as it had been on the spinning mule. He had saved his wages, week by week, penny by penny, to buy his freedom from the factory. At 19 years old, he had walked away from the spinning jenny for the last time, his small trunk packed, his gaze fixed south on Glasgow. He enrolled at Anderson's College. The city was a shock, a sprawling grey giant of smoke and scholarship, of desperate poverty and profound learning. He found a tiny, cheap room in a crowded tenement. He lived on oatmeal and water, pouring every spare shilling into his books, his tuition, his classes. He was a strange figure to his fellow students. He was older, rougher, his hands still calloused from the mill. He had no polish, no easy social graces. He spoke with a thick, broad Lanarkshire burr. But in the lecture hall, he was a giant. He studied chemistry under Thomas Graham. He studied medicine. He also attended divinity lectures and Greek classes, his mind absorbing it all, weaving it together. His medical studies were an act of worship. He saw in the intricate maps of the nervous system, in the delicate architecture of the human hand, the unmistakable signature of a divine creator. This was God's handiwork, and to learn to heal it, to mend what was broken, was to participate in the ministry of Christ himself. He was not studying to become a wealthy city doctor. He was studying to become a tool. Every lecture, every textbook, every long night of memorization was a step closer to the single, burning goal: China. The vision of Carl Gutzlaff, of healing bodies to open a door to the soul, had never left him. He applied to the London Missionary Society. It was the great leap of faith, the moment his private vow became a public petition. He traveled south to London, a city that dwarfed even Glasgow, a sprawling, bewildering center of empire and faith. He stood before a committee of serious, learned men in frock coats. They saw his rough hands. They heard his thick, country accent. They questioned his lack of classical education. They were skeptical. They saw a plowman, not a preacher. But they also saw a fire in his eyes, a determination that was as solid and unyielding as Scottish granite. They decided to test him. They sent him for probation, a 3-month trial, to a minister in a small village named Chipping Ongar in Essex. Here, his faith and his calling would be truly measured. He was given tasks. He learned to farm. He learned to grind grain, a task he found far more difficult than Latin. He was asked to study theology, and he was asked to prepare a sermon. This was the test he dreaded. He was a man of action, not of elegant words. He was a thinker, not an orator. He prepared his sermon with meticulous care. He wrote it, memorized it, rehearsed it. The day came. He walked to the small village chapel and climbed the few wooden steps into the pulpit. He looked out at the small congregation, a sea of expectant, quiet faces. He announced his text from the Bible, and then the words vanished. His carefully prepared thoughts, his hours of study, evaporated into a cold, hollow silence. He stood there, his mind a complete blank. He looked at the faces, and they looked back at him. After a long, agonizing moment, he stammered, "Friends, I have forgotten all I had to say." He then turned, walked down the steps, took his hat, and fled the building. He was mortified. He walked the country lanes for hours, certain his dream was over. He had failed. He had been tested and found wanting. The London Missionary Society would reject him, and he would be forced to return to Scotland in shame. A doctor, perhaps, but not a missionary. He was a man of iron will, but this failure struck at the very core of his identity. He had failed in the one thing they believed mattered most. But God had placed a man of wisdom in Chipping Ongar. The minister, Richard Cecil, saw past the disastrous sermon. He saw the young man who rose before dawn to study. He saw the man who worked in the fields without complaint. He saw the iron-willed determination, the humble heart, the deep, unshakable faith. He wrote back to the directors of the society. He told them of the sermon, but he concluded his letter with words of profound foresight. He said that David Livingstone was a man of great promise, a man who might fail in the pulpit, but who would never fail in the field. He wrote, "He will do for a pioneer." The society listened. They saw what Cecil saw. They formally accepted David Livingstone as a missionary candidate in 1840. His path was set. He returned to Glasgow to complete his final medical qualifications. He was now Dr. Livingstone. He was ordained in London. His trunk was packed. His heart was fixed. China. Then the news arrived. It came by ship, carried on the slow currents of the ocean, a story of cannon fire and political conflict. The First Opium War had broken out. Britain was at war with China. The ports were closed. Missionaries were being expelled, not welcomed. The very nation he had spent a decade preparing for was now an impossible destination. For 10 years, his life had a single direction. For 10 years, every action had a single purpose. China, China, China. And now, in a moment, the door did not just close. It was slammed shut and locked by the ugly mechanisms of war, of politics, of the very opium trade he had prayed against. He was a missionary with no destination. He was a doctor with no patience. He was a man of God, waiting in the quiet, agonizing space between a call and a commission. He remained in London, working at a hospital, studying, praying, and waiting for guidance. He attended missionary meetings, listening to reports from around the world. One evening, a man took the stage. He was not a polished speaker, but he had a presence that filled the room. He was a man with a face weathered by a foreign sun, a man whose hands had built a life in a wild land. His name was Robert Moffat. Moffat was a legend in the missionary world. He was a fellow Scot, a gardener who had gone to Africa over 20 years earlier. He had established a thriving mission station at Kuruman, in the vast, dry expanse of Bechuanaland, in what is now South Africa. He had translated the Bible into the Tswana language. He was home on furlough, and he spoke of his work. He spoke of Africa. He did not speak of an easy life. He spoke of drought, of conflict, of disease, of the slow, patient work of translation and teaching. But then he spoke of the interior. He spoke of the lands beyond his station, the lands to the north. He painted a picture of a vast, uncharted continent, a place unknown to any mapmaker. He described a journey he had taken, pushing farther north than any European had gone before. And then he spoke the words that would alter the course of David's life. He said, "I have sometimes seen in the morning sun the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been." The words landed in David's heart with the weight of revelation. The smoke of 1,000 villages, not a closed-off nation, but an open, uncharted expanse. Not a single target, but 1,000. It was not a call to a station, to a settled post. It was a call to a frontier. It was a call for a pioneer. After the meeting, David sought out the veteran missionary. He introduced himself, this young, intense doctor with no place to go. He asked Moffat, with his typical blunt honesty, about the land, about the work. He asked if he, a man who had failed in the pulpit, a man built for walking and for working, would be of use in Africa. Moffat looked at him. He saw the same granite will that Cecil had seen, and he encouraged him. He told him to go north, to not build on another man's foundation, but to press into the interior, to those waiting villages. The pivot was complete. The promise made in the mill was not broken. It was transformed. The path to China, so clear and straight, had vanished. In its place, God had laid down an entire continent. The door he had been staring at was locked, but beside it, a gateway as wide as the horizon had been opened. David Livingstone accepted his new commission. He would not go east. He would go south, to the very tip of Africa. And from there, he would go north to find the smoke of those 1,000 villages. The smoke of 1,000 villages. The deck of the George pitched and rolled. A 9-week journey on a heaving, endless ocean. When the shape of Africa finally solidified on the horizon, a low, purple line against the rising sun, it was not just a continent David saw. It was the physical form of his divine calling. He had sailed from London on December 8th, 1840, a passenger on a cargo ship, a man suspended between two worlds, the cold, damp air of Scotland, the roar of the spinning jenny, the familiar grey stones of Glasgow. All of it had dissolved behind him. His new world was the smell of salt and tar, the constant, rhythmic groan of the ship's timbers, the rush of water against the hull. He was 27 years old, a doctor and an ordained minister, but he felt like a student once more. He did not waste a single day of the long voyage. While other passengers battled seasickness or boredom, David was at work. He sat on the swaying deck, his books braced against the roll of the ship. He was learning Tswana, the language of the people he had been sent to serve, his lips forming the strange and difficult clicking sounds, his mind memorizing grammar and vocabulary. He joined the ship's captain on the quarterdeck, learning to use the sextant, to read the stars, to chart a course on a blank and shifting sea. He did not know why. He only knew that his call was to the interior, and any knowledge, any skill might be of use. He was already becoming an explorer. The Atlantic Ocean was his first wilderness, a vast, quiet space provided by God for his final preparation. In March of 1841, the George dropped anchor in Algoa Bay at the edge of South Africa. He stepped onto the shore, his legs unsteady on the solid ground. This was Africa, but it was not the Africa of his vision. This was a colonial port, a town of traders, settlers, and soldiers. He saw the complex, troubled lines drawn between the Europeans and the native peoples. He saw the assumptions of superiority, and he saw mission stations that looked like comfortable English villages with tidy houses and small, settled congregations. He was polite, but his spirit was restless. This was not what he had come for. This was not the frontier. He purchased a heavy wooden wagon, a team of oxen, and a guide, and he pointed his life north, away from the coast, away from the settled towns, toward the interior. The journey from Algoa Bay to Kuruman was 700 miles. It was a slow, grinding pilgrimage, an immersion into the land he had come to serve. The wagon wheels became his new rhythm, the slow, lumbering pace of the oxen, his new clock. The sun was a physical weight, a relentless, baking heat he had never known in the mists of Scotland. The dust was a constant companion, a fine red powder that coated his skin, his clothes, his books. He learned the patience of the ox. He learned that progress in this land was not measured in hours or days, but in weeks and months. The nights were a revelation. The oppressive heat of the day would vanish, replaced by a profound, clear cold. The sky was not the familiar, clouded sheet of Britain. It was an explosion of stars, a dome of brilliant cold light, so vast and so close, it felt as if he could touch it. He would build a fire, the wood of the thorn tree crackling, its smoke rising in a single straight column into the still air. He would listen to the new sounds of the night, the distant call of a jackal, the rustle of an unseen creature in the bush, the deep, rumbling snores of his men. This was the Africa of his prayers. This was the edge of the unknown. And in the vast, intimidating silence, he felt the peace of God. He was not afraid. He was home. On July 31st, 1841, after 2 months on the wagon, he saw it. A line of green in the distance, a sight so impossible in the red desert, it seemed like a mirage. This was Kuruman, the mission station of Robert Moffat. It was an oasis, a testament to one man's unbending faith and tireless labor. Moffat, the man whose words had captured David's imagination, had been here for 20 years. He had dug, by hand, a long irrigation ditch, channeling the sweet water of the Kuruman spring. In this desert, He had created a garden. There were fruit trees, fields of grain, rows of vegetables. A stone church rose from the earth, its walls thick and cool. There was a school for the Tswana children, and there was a printing press, the sacred machine that had given the people the word of God in their own language. Livingstone was welcomed with warmth. He saw the good in this place. He saw the stability, the order, the community. He saw families who gathered for worship, children who learned to read, and people who were safe and fed. He respected Robert Moffat and all that he had built. He saw the value of this patient, rooted work. And yet, almost immediately, David's eyes turned north to the blue haze of the horizon. He admired Kuruman, but he had no desire to inherit it. He had not sailed across the world to tend an irrigated garden or preach to the already converted. In his letters home, he wrote with deep respect for Moffat, but with a clear, personal reservation. He felt the station system, for all its good, was incomplete. It was a safe harbor on the edge of a vast, uncharted ocean. His call was to that ocean. His call was to those other villages, the smoke of 1,000 villages. The phrase was not a metaphor to him. It was a map. It was a divine commission. He felt a holy restlessness, a profound, unceasing pull toward the vast, unknown interior. He saw the Tswana people at Kuruman, and his heart was moved, but his mind was already calculating the distance to the next tribe, and the tribe after that, and the tribe after that. He would not be a station missionary. He would be a pioneer. He would go, as the first apostles did, from village to village, with no home but the road, no church but the shade of a tree. He would live with the people. He would eat their food, learn their customs, and sleep in their huts. He would be a doctor, mending their bodies as a bridge to their hearts. He would not build a fortress. He would open a path. He did not wait long to test this vision. With Moffat's blessing, he began a series of long journeys, pushing deep into the interior, farther north than Moffat had ever gone. He traveled 700 miles, leaving his heavy wagon behind. He learned to ride an ox, the only animal that could survive the dry, thorny landscape where horses perished from disease. He traveled light with a few African companions. He slept on the hard ground under the stars. He met chiefs and tribes who had never seen a white man, whose only image of pale skin was the ruthless Boer commando or the slave trader. They were suspicious. They were wary. But David was different. He did not come with a gun, demanding tribute. He came with a medical kit, offering healing. He sat by their fires, not as a master, but as a guest. He listened, he learned, he waited, he proved to himself and to the Missionary Society that he could survive. He was not just a mill worker from Glasgow, he was an African explorer in the service of God. These journeys confirmed his calling. The vast, sun-scorched land, the endless horizon, the smoke of villages rising in the clear morning air. This was his cathedral. This was his true home. But as he returned to the green, orderly oasis of Kuruman, a different, quieter call was making itself known. His life was one of motion and hardship, but he was not made of stone. He saw in Robert Moffat's daughter, Mary, a spirit as strong and as rooted in Africa as his own. A home for Mary. David Livingstone was a man built for the hard earth and the open sky. He was not a man given to easy comforts. But when he looked at Mary Moffat, the eldest daughter of the mission, his restless heart felt an unfamiliar pull. a quiet, steady call toward a different kind of journey. She was not a stranger to this land. She was a child of it. While David was a boy, breathing the cotton dust of Blantyre, Mary was a child breathing the clean, dry air of the African interior. She was born at Griquatown, a frontier station even rougher than Kuruman. This was her home. She was not a delicate English flower, ill-suited to the dust and the heat. She was practical, she was strong, she was profoundly resilient. She spoke the Tswana language as fluently as she spoke English, perhaps more so. She understood the rhythms of the mission, the patience required, the slow, grinding work of translation, the careful, respectful building of trust. She'd seen the years of drought when the land turned to iron and the sky was a merciless, empty blue. She had seen her father, Robert, labor for a decade before he saw his first convert. She knew the cost of this life, a cost David was only just beginning to learn. Mary had recently returned from schooling in England, and the land of her parents felt foreign and cold to her. Her heart was in Africa, under the vast open sky, among the people she had known since birth. David, the intense, socially awkward, and single-minded pioneer, found himself drawn to her quiet competence. She was not impressed by his grand ambitions or his long journeys. She was grounded in the reality of the work. She possessed a deep, steady faith that was not loud, but was as solid as the earth beneath their feet. His courtship was as blunt and as honest as the man himself. He was not a poet. He did not possess the easy graces of a city gentleman. His first letters to her were almost clumsy, filled more with theology and his plans for the future than with traditional romance. But he saw in her, with the clear, piercing gaze of a man who knows his purpose, the one woman who could be his partner. He was not looking for a wife to keep a comfortable home for him. He was looking for a helpmeet, a fellow soldier, a woman who would not hold him back from the smoke of those 1,000 villages, but who would walk beside him into the haze. He wrote to her, asking her to join him in a life of roving and hardship. It was the most honest proposal he could make, and Mary, with a wisdom and courage that matched his own, understood. She saw the truth of his calling. She knew, better than he, what that hardship would mean. It would mean leaving the safety of her family, the green, irrigated gardens of Kuruman. It would mean loneliness, danger, and a life spent on the very edge of the known world. And in her heart, she felt the same, quiet, divine pull. She said yes. They were married in January of 1845. The ceremony was simple, held in the stone church at Kuruman, the oasis her father had built from the dust. For a brief moment, there was peace, a sense of family, a quiet joy. But David's eyes were already fixed on the northern horizon. He had chosen their first post. It was a place 200 miles northeast, a valley called Mabotsa, the home of the Bagatla people. Their honeymoon was a long, slow, grinding trek by ox wagon. They left the green of Kuruman behind them, and the land became dry, rocky, and wild. This was not a garden. This was the frontier. When they arrived, there was nothing. There was no house. There was no church. There was no school. There was only the red earth, the shade of the thorn trees, and the small, scattered village of the Bakatla. This was the blank page upon which their life together would be written. David, the practical man of the mill, set to work. He was a builder. He cut timber from the hills. He dug clay from the riverbed and formed it into bricks. laying them out to bake in the relentless African sun. With his own hands, the same hands that had mended cotton threads and held a surgeon's scalpel, he built their first home. It was a simple, square structure with a mud floor and a roof of cut reeds. It was small, it was rough, but it was theirs. Mary, the practical daughter of the mission, made this house a home. She planted a garden, a small patch of green against the red dust. She arranged their few, simple belongings. She established a rhythm of life in the wilderness. Their mission began, not with a grand sermon, but with simple, daily acts of service. David started a school under the shade of a large camel thorn tree, gathering the children of the village. He opened his medical kit, and the people, wary at first, began to come. He treated infected wounds. He set broken bones. He dispensed medicine for fevers. He was their doctor. He was their teacher. He began to preach, not from a high pulpit, but sitting on the ground in the village kotla, the public meeting place, speaking to the men in their own language about the God who loved them. Mary worked with the women and children, teaching them, sewing with them, listening to them. This was the vision. This was the dream of Karl Gutzlaff, of medicine and ministry, made real in a small, remote valley. This was the home for Mary. It was a life of shared purpose. David would rise before dawn, study the language, then work his garden before the heat of the day. Then he would teach, or heal, or hunt for their food. In the evenings, he would write in his journals, his scientific mind carefully noting the botany, the geology, the customs of the people. Mary was his anchor, his partner in all things. They were a team. They were united. But the wilderness is not a tame and gentle place. It is beautiful, but it holds a deep and ancient danger. The Bakatla people were cattle herders. Their animals were their wealth, their food, their entire livelihood. And their livelihood was being stolen. A pride of lions had taken up residence in the hills around the valley. They were not just hunting wild game. They had grown bold. At night, the village would be shattered by a terrible roar, by the panicked stampede of the cattle, and the men would awaken to find another of their precious oxen dead, its body dragged against the thorn bush enclosure. A shadow fell over the village. This was not just a threat, it was a crisis. The people were gripped by fear. They believed these were not ordinary lions. They believed they were bewitched, sent by a rival chief. David, the man of science and faith, saw their fear. He knew this was not sorcery. This was a natural problem, a simple, deadly conflict between man and beast. And as a member of their community, as their doctor, as their friend, he knew it was his duty to help. The village elders decided the lions must be hunted. They asked David, the man with the European rifle, the man who had built his house among them, to lead the hunt. He agreed. He was a man of peace, but he was also a protector. He prepared his rifle, checking the powder, the lead balls. He spoke with his Tswana schoolteacher, a brave and faithful man named Mabalwi, who would go with him. The air was hot and still. The sun beat down on the valley. He said goodbye to Mary, a simple, routine farewell. He was just going to help his neighbors. He walked out of the small, mud-walled house his hands had built, his eyes scanning the rocky ridges, searching for the shadows that were threatening his new home. The roar and the thorn. The first roar was a low, guttural vibration that the men felt in the ground before they heard it. The sound seemed to come from the stones themselves, a a tremor of deep territorial anger. The second roar was not tremor. It was a crack of thunder, pure concentrated fury, and it was close. David and the men of the Bakatla moved with cautious, practiced steps. They were not soldiers, they were herders, armed with hide shields and iron-tipped spears. They were walking into the lion's own house to protect their own. The sun was high, baking the red earth and the rocky hills. The air was still. David walked ahead, his double-barreled rifle, a heavy, unfamiliar weight in his hands. He was a doctor, a man of healing. But today, he was a protector, a member of the community, sharing their burden. They tracked the lions to a small wooded hill, a kopje strewn with boulders and thick, thorny brush. The men began to form a wide circle, their voices calling out, their spears striking their shields, trying to flush the great cats from their cover. From within the thicket, a lion roared its defiance. The men grew quiet. They knew the danger. This was the moment of truth. David moved forward with his Tswana teacher, Mebalwe, a man of quiet courage and strong faith. David needed a clear view. He needed to end this. He saw a shape in the shadows, a flicker of tawny fur against the grey rock. He edged closer, his boots crunching on the dry gravel. He found a small, clear rise, a natural platform. He could see the lion now, a magnificent, terrible beast, sitting on a rock, watching him. David raised the heavy rifle. He took a steadying breath. The world narrowed to the small metal sight at the end of the barrel. He aimed carefully for the chest and fired. The shot cracked open the silence, a cloud of white smoke instantly obscuring his vision. He heard a furious snarl. He fired the second barrel into the smoke. The men shouted. Through the haze, they could see the lion, wounded, furious, thrashing in the brush. David began the slow, methodical process of reloading. In this critical moment, his weapon was useless. He had to pour the powder, place the patch, drop the lead ball, and ram it home. He was bent over his task, his head down, his hands working quickly, when he heard a shout of pure terror. He looked up. The lion was in the air. It was not a leap. It was a silent, fluid explosion of muscle and claws. He had no time to move, no time to even raise his arm. The beast struck him with the force of a falling boulder. He felt a crushing weight on his shoulder, and then an indescribable sickening crunch as the lion's jaws closed on his upper arm. The great beast lifted him from the ground and shook him, as a terrier dog shakes a rat. He was a doll in the mouth of the animal, his body limp, his senses suddenly, strangely calm. There was no pain, there was no terror. As he wrote later, a marvelous state of peace settled over him. It was not a stupor of fear, but a dreamy stillness, a curious detachment. He was fully conscious. He watched the lion's eyes only inches from his own, and he felt the hot, rank breath on his face. He felt the animal's deep, chest-rattling growl vibrate through his own bones. He knew this was death. He was being crushed, and yet he felt as if he were watching from a great distance, held in a quiet, providential bubble, a stillness that only God could provide. The world was silent, save for the low growl of the beast that was killing him. In that strange, suspended moment, he saw his companion, Mebalwe. The brave man had not fled. He stood just 10 feet away, his own rifle raised, aiming to save his friend. He fired, but the gun, a faulty trade musket, only flashed in the pan. The powder ignited, but the ball did not fire. The sound, the flash, was enough. The lion, seeing this new threat, instantly released David. He fell to the ground, a broken, useless heap. The lion sprang upon Mibalwi, seizing his thigh in its powerful jaws. Another man, his name lost to history, saw his teacher under attack and lunged forward, thrusting his spear at the lion. The beast, enraged, left Mibalwi and lunged at the third man, biting him on the shoulder. It was an attack of terrible, desperate fury, but it was the lion's last. The 2 bullets David had fired, the shots he thought had failed, had struck true. They had hit the lion's lungs. The animal, in its death throe, had expended its last furious energy on David and his friends. It stood for a moment, its great head swaying, and then, with a low, final sigh, it collapsed, dead, upon the man it had last attacked. Silence returned to the hillside. The dust began to settle. The smell of gunpowder and blood hung in the hot, still air. David lay on the ground, the dreamy peace evaporating, the first searing waves of pain beginning to rise. He looked at his arm. It was a ruin. The thick woolen jacket was shredded, soaked in a dark, spreading red. The bone was not merely broken. It was crushed, ground into, in his own medical words, splinters. 11 tooth marks were clearly visible. He was a doctor. His training took over. He looked at Mibalwi, bleeding heavily from the wound in his thigh. He looked at the other man, pale with shock, the lion still lying on top of him. David gave instructions. His voice was weak, but steady. He told the men how to use a strip of cloth as a tourniquet, how to stop the bleeding, and how to move the lion's heavy carcass. He was a patient, but he was still the physician. They carried him back to Mabotsa. The journey was a slow, agonizing blur. Every jolt of the makeshift litter sent a fresh explosion of pain through his shoulder. He arrived at the small mud-walled house his own hands had built, and Mary came out to meet him. She saw his face, ashen gray. She saw the blood-soaked rags. Her face was pale, but she did not cry. She was a child of Africa. She was a Moffat. She helped carry him inside and lay him on their simple bed. The healing was a long and terrible ordeal. He was the only doctor for hundreds of miles. He had to instruct Mary, who had no medical training, how to help him set his own shattered arm. The bone was so fragmented, a comminuted fracture, that it was impossible to set properly. They built a crude sling. They bound it as tightly as they could, but the work was imperfect. For weeks, he lay in the small, hot room, drifting in and out of a fever, the pain a constant, burning fire. He did not despair. He did not question God's purpose. In that long, painful darkness, he felt a profound, settling clarity. He saw the hand of God in the whole terrible event. He saw the providence in the lion attacking him, the one man whose European clothing gave him a small measure of protection. He saw the providence in the marvelous state of peace that had guarded his mind from terror. He saw the providence in his 2 bullets, which had been fatal, sparing his companions from the lion's full strength. He emerged from that room weeks later, a changed man. His arm had healed, but it was forever damaged. The bone had not fused correctly, creating a flail joint, a false, loose connection. He would never again be able to lift a rifle to his shoulder. He would never again have full use of that arm. For the rest of his life, he would carry the physical scar of that day, a constant, aching reminder. But he carried a deeper mark on his soul. He did not see the wound as a curse. He saw it as a seal. He felt that God had brought him to the very jaws of death, had held him there, and had delivered him. His life was no longer his own. It had been given back to him, consecrated for a purpose. If God could deliver him from the mouth of a lion, what hostile king, what raging river, what burning fever could truly stand against him? The attack was not a warning to retreat. It was a commission to go forward. He would carry the mark of the lion on his shoulder forever, a testament to his human fragility. But he carried a deeper mark on his heart, an unshakable, forged-in-bone conviction that his life was held in a hand far stronger than his own. The unforgiving Kalahari. The sand was an ocean, and the sun was an enemy. The oxen strained against the yokes, their hooves sinking deep, and the wagon wheels were a symphony of creaks and groans. This was not a journey. It was a siege, a slow, patient assault on a fortress of heat and thirst. David's arm had healed, a permanent, visible reminder of God's deliverance. But the valley of Mabotsa, the small home he'd built, no longer felt safe. The lion was gone, but a new, more persistent shadow had fallen. It was the shadow of the Boers, the Dutch-descended settlers pushing north from the Cape. They were men of iron will, but their faith was not David's faith. They saw the African people as a source of labor, a people to be subdued, not as brothers and sisters to be educated and uplifted. They saw David's school, his preaching of equality, his respect for the chiefs, as a threat to their way of life. They whispered that he was supplying the tribes with guns. They watched him. They distrusted him. He knew he could not build a lasting church on a foundation of conflict. His call was not to political dispute. His call was to the north, to the unreached, to the lands free from this bitter strife. He gathered his small community, his faithful Bagatla, and they moved. They traveled 40 miles to a new valley called Chonuane. And he began again. He cut timber. He molded bricks. He built a new house. He planted a new garden. He started a new school. But the land itself was hard. A severe drought seized the valley. The sky became a sheet of brass, reflecting the heat, refusing to yield a single drop of rain. The river, the lifeblood of the place, shrank to a series of muddy pools, and then, finally, to a long, cracked scar of dust. The crops withered. The animals grew weak. The people began to starve. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that man could build, but only God could give the increase. So they moved again, a final move. They traveled to Kolobeng by a river that promised a more permanent flow. Here, David would build his last home. He built it not of mud and reeds, but of stone, a solid, square house that still stands to this day. He built a forge, his blantyre muscles remembering the rhythm of the hammer. He became a blacksmith, a carpenter, a gunsmith, repairing the hunting rifles for the tribe. He dug a long irrigation ditch, and this time, the garden flourished. Mary, his steady, constant wife, made this stone house a home. It was here she gave birth to their children, Robert, Agnes, Thomas. The house was no longer a silent outpost. It was filled with the sounds of a young family. It was, for a brief, fleeting moment, a picture of settled life. But David's eyes were not on his stone house. They were on the horizon. To the north, separating him from the heart of the continent, lay the Kalahari. The tribes called it the Great Thirst Land. It was a vast, waterless sea of sand and thorn, a barrier that had defeated every traveler, every trader, every hunter. The Boers feared it. The tribes respected its terrible power. But David Livingstone, the man of singular focus, saw it differently. He saw it as a divine gate. He called it the Missionary Road. He became convinced that if he, by the grace of God, could find a path through that desert. He could open a highway for the gospel, a road that would lead him to the unreached, a road his enemies could not or would not follow. The Kalahari became his holy obsession. He tried, he failed. He pushed his wagon into the scrub, and the desert pushed him back. His oxen, their eyes wild with thirst, collapsed in their yokes. His guides, their own courage failing, advised retreat. He was forced to turn back, his throat choked with dust, his spirit tested but not broken. He sat in his stone house at Kolobeng, the cries of his children in his ears, and he felt the profound, agonizing tension of his life. He was a husband, he was a father, he loved Mary, he loved his children, but the vision of those 1,000 villages, the smoke on the far horizon, burned in his soul with a fire that gave him no peace. Mary, born in this land, a child of the frontier, understood the man she had married. She saw his restless heart. She knew his divine calling. She did not ask him to set it aside. She asked only how they would go. In 1849, he resolved to try again. This time, he would not go unprepared. He found partners. 2 English hunters, William Cotton Oswell and Mungo Murray. Oswell was a man of great wealth, a hunter of elephants, but also a man of quiet, generous faith. He believed in David's vision. He funded the expedition, providing the best wagons, the strongest, most seasoned oxen, the supplies they would need. And then David made a decision that stills the heart, a decision of terrifying faith. He would not leave his family behind. He would bring them. Mary, 8 months pregnant with their 4th child, his 3 small children, Robert, Agnes, and Thomas. He believed that where God called him to go, God would protect his family. They set out. The heavy wagons, loaded with barrels of water, plunged into the deep, soft sand. The wheels did not roll, they dragged. The sound was a constant, mournful, grinding groan. The world shrank to a monotonous, endless sea of grey thorn scrub and shimmering false horizons. The heat was a physical weight, a hammer of white-hot light that beat down from a cloudless sky. The air was so dry it seemed to pull the moisture from the very skin. Mirages danced in the distance, cruel visions of lakes and rivers that dissolved into dry, cracked earth. The children cried, their lips cracking, their bodies slick with the feverish heat. The oxen, 10 to each wagon, pulled with their heads low, their breath coming in heaving, dusty gasps. They traveled by night, the sand a little cooler, the brilliant, cold stars their only map. By day, they rested, huddled under the scant, thin shade of a camelthorn tree, the air too hot to breathe, the world too hot to move. Mary, his incredible stoic Mary, was the quiet center of their survival. She tended to the children, she rationed the water, sip by precious sip. She calmed their fears. Her own heart was surely a knot of anxiety, a mother's terror for the lives of her children, but her faith was her shield. She had said yes to a life of hardship, and she lived it with a grace and a strength that equaled his own. They were not alone. They were led by local guides, men of the desert, who knew the secrets of this terrible land. God's provision came not as a miracle from the sky, but in the ancestral knowledge of these men. They led the caravan from one hidden water source to the next, places a European would never find. A cluster of reeds, a hollow in the earth, a patch of ground where water lay a few feet beneath the sand. For weeks, they pushed north, a tiny crawling island of life in a dead sea. Then, one day, the air changed. It was a subtle shift, a hint of moisture, a different smell on the wind. They saw new birds in the sky, birds that lived on water. The scrub began to thin. Tall green reeds appeared in the distance. The ground became damp, then soft. The oxen, smelling the change, pulled harder, their pace quickening. The men walked ahead, their steps suddenly light, their hope renewed. And then they saw it. It was not a mirage. It was a vast, shimmering, impossible sheet of water. It stretched to the horizon, a glittering expanse under the African sun. This was Lake Ngami. They had done it. They had crossed the Kalahari. David stood at the shore, his children splashing in the shallows, Mary resting in the shade of the wagon. He was the first European to ever see this vast inland sea. But it was not a moment of pride. It was a moment of profound, reverent awe. He knelt by the water's edge. God had heard his prayer. God had honored his faith. He had found his missionary road. The discovery of the lake was a triumph, a vindication of his unbending will. But the water itself was not the destination. It was a sign. It was a doorway. And the moment he saw it, the restless fire in his heart burned hotter, pulling him forward toward the lands that lay beyond. The path among the rivers. The river was a highway. It was the lifeblood of the land, a moving, pulsing artery that could carry trade, carry life, or carry the long, dark shadow of death. David stood at its edge, and he knew this was the new road God had laid before him, a path of water that would lead him to the heart of a continent. He had stood on the shore of Lake Ngami, a moment of triumph, a vindication of his faith. But the triumph had been followed by a season of profound testing. The missionary road he had opened was a road of hardship. He had brought his family, Mary, and his small children to this new frontier, but the frontier was an unforgiving home. He had seen the cost of his calling, written not in his own suffering, but in the pale, tired faces of his children, in the constant, weary strength of his wife. The land was rife with fever, and the small bodies of his children were vulnerable. He had buried his infant daughter, Elizabeth. She had lived only 6 weeks, a tiny, fragile life given and taken in the wilderness. The stone he'd placed over her small grave at Kolobeng felt like a weight in his own heart. He loved his family. They were his one true earthly comfort. But he saw the truth. This was not a life for them. His calling was to be a pathfinder, a man of constant motion, a man who would walk into the fever mist, who would face the unknown. He could not drag his wife and children with him on that journey. He could not ask them to pay that price. And Mary, his rock, his partner, the woman born of this very land, she too saw the truth. She knew the man she had married. She knew the fire of his calling, a fire lit by God, a fire she could not and would not ask him to extinguish. The decision was made. It was the greatest sacrifice of his life, a tearing of his own heart. He would send them home. He would send them to England, to safety, to health, to education. He would send them to a world he had left behind, a world they had never known. The long, slow wagon ride to Cape Town was a journey of over 1,000 miles. It was a final pilgrimage together, a long, slow funeral procession for their shared life. Every turn of the wagon wheel was a tick of a clock, counting down the moments until their separation. They reached the coast in April of 1852. The children, Robert and Agnes and Thomas, looked in wonder at the ocean, this vast, impossible body of water, so much greater than any river. To David, it was a wall of separation. He stood on the dock, the smell of salt and tar thick in the air. He held Mary's hand. He kissed his children. He watched them walk up the gangplank of the ship, the Trafalgar. He watched as the sailors cast off the lines, as the heavy canvas sails unfurled and caught the wind. He watched the ship become a small, white speck on the horizon. He watched until it was gone. And then he was, for the first time, utterly alone. He wrote in his journal, "The severing of the ties of family is a trial I feel very keenly." He stood on the shore for a moment, a man hollowed by his own choice. And then he turned his face north. He had no house. He had no family. He had no worldly comforts. He had only his God and the smoke of 1,000 villages waiting. His old life was over. While he was in Cape Town, news reached him that the Boers, his old antagonists, had finally acted. They had ridden into his valley at Kolobeng. They had destroyed his stone house, shattered his furniture, torn his books, and stolen his cattle. His mission station was in ashes. God had, with a terrible and decisive hand, burned the bridge behind him. There was no going back. He was not a settler. He was a pathfinder. He traveled north, back to the lands he'd explored, to the people of the Makololo. He came to them not as a wealthy European, but as a humble traveler, dependent on their kindness. He was welcomed by the great chief Sebituane, a wise, visionary leader who had longed for a missionary, for a teacher, for a link to the outside world. The chief gave David a home, a place of honor. A deep bond formed between these two men, a bond of mutual respect. But this too was a fleeting comfort. Just weeks after David's arrival, Sebitone fell ill and died. The mission seemed cursed. His family was gone. His home was destroyed. His newfound protector was dead. But David's faith did not waver. The chief's son, Sekeletu, rose to power. He was a young man, but he honored the bond his father had forged. He trusted Livingstone. He too wanted a path to the outside world. David's vision had now crystallized. He had seen the land, he had seen the people, and he had seen the great consuming shadow that lay upon it. He had seen the slave trade. He had seen the long shuffling lines of captives, their necks locked in heavy wooden yokes. He had seen the burned out villages, the fields left to rot, the look of bottomless despair in the eyes of the captives. This open sore of the world, as he would later call it, was the defining evil of the continent. And he knew, with a prophet's certainty, that preaching alone would not stop it. His plan was a revelation. It was practical. It was divine. He called it Christianity and commerce. He believed that the slave trade flourished in the dark, in the isolation of the interior. If he could open a highway, a safe, reliable road to the coast, then legitimate trade could enter. If the people could sell their cotton, their ivory, their other goods, they would have a peaceful, profitable alternative to the buying and selling of human life. Commerce would be the tool to break the chains, and Christianity, the light of the gospel, would travel that same open road. This was his new, all-consuming quest. He needed to find that highway. He was on the Zambezi River, the great artery of southern Africa. He would try to follow it east to the Indian Ocean. Sekeletu gave him canoes and 27 of his best men as companions and guides. These men were his new family. They were his lifeline. They set out on the wide, brown river. But the river was not a simple highway. It was a land of its own, a world of hippos, that could crush a canoe, of crocodiles that slid like logs from the muddy banks. And it was a world of an enemy he could not fight, a tiny, winged tyrant, the tsetse fly. He watched as his oxen, his pack animals, were bitten. He saw them grow weak, their coats staring, their eyes glazing over, until they stumbled and fell and died. This was the wall. The tsetse fly made the eastern path, the path of the wagon, impossible. He was stopped. He was blocked. He was in the very center of the continent, cut off from the east. He had only the river. So he looked west. If he could not reach the Indian Ocean, he would try for the Atlantic. He would trace the rivers backward. He would follow the tributaries, pushing his way through swamps and forests, across plains, to the Portuguese port of Luanda. It was a journey of more than 1,000 miles, through territory no European had ever seen. In November of 1853, he stood with his 27 Makololo companions. He had a small tent, a few scientific instruments, a small supply of medicine, and his Bible. He was thin, already weakened by repeated bouts of fever, his body a map of his struggles. He looked at his men, their faces strong, their trust in him absolute. He committed their way to God. He stepped into the canoe. The paddles dipped into the water, a quiet, rhythmic splash. He was a man stripped of everything, his home, his family, his health, his country. He had only his God, his companions, and the slow, steady pull of the current, a path of water leading him west, deep into the unknown heart of a continent. The smoke that thunders. He had heard the sound for miles. At first, it was a low, constant rumble, a vibration that seemed to travel not through the air, but through the very water of the river, a tremor felt in the hollow of the canoe. The local people called it Mosi-oa-Tunya, the smoke that thunders. As they drew closer, the rumble grew into a steady, deafening roar. This was the great Zambezi River. David was following it east, fulfilling the second half of his continental traverse. He had returned from the Atlantic, from the port of Luanda, a journey that had nearly claimed his life. He had returned to his faithful Makololo companions, a man of his word, a man who would not abandon them. And now, they traveled with the current, their destination the Indian Ocean, their highway this magnificent mile-wide river. The river here was a different world. It was wide, placid, and dotted with islands, each one a lush green paradise of date palms and fig trees and silver-needled acacias. The water was calm. The canoes, paddled by his expert Makololo boatmen, slid through the water with a quiet, rhythmic splash. The land was generous, teeming with herds of buffalo, zebra, and elephant that came to the banks to drink. It was a peaceful, beautiful, almost dreamlike passage. But the sound was growing, and with the sound came the smoke. In the clear, blue morning air, he saw them, 5 great columns rising from the river, white, billowing, and immense. They climbed thousands of feet into the sky, their tops catching the sun, looking for all the world, like the smoke from a massive, uncontrollable grass fire. But this smoke was born of water. This was the smoke that thunders. His men, brave veterans of the long march to the coast, grew quiet. They were afraid. They knew this place. This was a sacred, terrible chasm. They believed a spirit, a monster, resided in the gorge, and that to look upon it was to invite death. They would go no further. They paddled him to a small island in the very center of the river, an island that stood on the precipice, on the very lip of the abyss. The ground beneath his feet was vibrating. The noise was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight, a solid wall of thundering power that shook his bones and made all speech, all thought, impossible. He left his men with the canoes. He walked through the small rainforest jungle that covered the island, a jungle that existed only because of the constant spray. The leaves were heavy with moisture. The air was thick and wet. He walked to the edge. He lay on his stomach, on the cold, black basalt rock, and he crept forward, his heart pounding, his senses overwhelmed. He peered over the brink. What he saw was not a river. It was an apocalypse of water. The entire mile-wide Zambezi, one of the great rivers of the world, was gathered in one massive, placid sheet. And then it simply vanished. It fell. It disappeared into a crack in the earth, a transverse chasm, a sheer dark slot in the planet, only 80 yards wide. The water did not cascade. It plummeted in one unbroken, terrifying fall, 400 feet straight down. He watched, mesmerized. The sheer, incomprehensible volume of water, the power, the relentless, thunderous descent. It was beyond the scale of human imagination. The water that fell was torn into a white, boiling, chaotic rage at the bottom. It struck the rock with a force that sent it exploding back upward, a cloud of pulverized spray, the smoke that rose in those 5 great columns. The sun struck the rising mist, and in the heart of the thunder, rainbows were born. They were not the faint, distant arcs he had known from Scotland. They were perfect, dazzling, complete circles of pure, liquid light, zones of brilliant color that hung in the abyss, shimmering against the black rock, defiant in the chaos. It was a vision of a covenant, a symbol of God's promise, placed in the center of the most terrifying, beautiful sight he had ever beheld. He was not a conqueror, planting a flag. He was a creature, humbled. He was the boy from the dark, roaring, man-made confines of the Blantyre cotton mill, and he was now lying on his stomach, drenched in spray, gazing into a chasm of God's own making. The sound was not the clatter of machinery. It was the voice of the Creator, a roar of pure, creative, magnificent power. He crept back from the edge, his clothes soaked, his mind reeling. He sat on the trembling ground, and his soul was filled with a profound, quiet awe. This was not a place of terror. This was a place of worship. In his journal, he would search for the words, and they would fail him. He would write, "It had never been seen before by European eyes, but scenes so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight." He felt small, and in his smallness, he felt the unutterable greatness of God. This was the artistry of his Father. This was the majesty of the one who had carved the world, who held the rivers in his hand. It was a gift, a private, thundering revelation, a moment of profound spiritual rest in the middle of his exhausting, fever-racked journey. He named it. It was the one great geographical monument to which he would ever attach a name. He did it not for himself, but in a moment of deep, patriotic reverence for his queen. He called it Victoria Falls, but in his heart, he knew the people of the land had named it best. Mosi-oa-Tunya, the smoke that thunders. This sublime, thundering vision was not the end of his road. It was a beautiful, terrible barrier. The calm river highway had ended at this cliff. Below the falls, the Zambezi did not widen again. It was trapped in a deep, zigzagging gorge, a canyon of boiling, impassable rapids. He could not take his canoes. He must leave the water, the path he had trusted, and strike out once more over land, the price of the coast. The fever was a fire in his blood, a relentless, burning siege. He was a skeleton, weakened by more than 30 separate attacks of malaria, and only the grace of God and the loyalty of his men kept him moving. His world had shrunk to the next painful step, his senses dimmed by a constant, buzzing ache. He was a ghost of the man who had left Scotland, a walking testament to the price of this continental quest. This was the journey west, the path to Luanda, the one he had chosen when the tsetse fly blocked his way to the east. He and his 27 Makololo companions had pushed into a land no map could describe. They had left the dry, familiar plains and entered a world of water. The rains began. It was not the soft, grey mist of Scotland. It was a deluge, a solid, falling ocean that lasted for months. The rivers overflowed their banks, turning the entire country into a vast, shallow, steaming swamp. Day after day, they did not walk. They waded. They pushed their way through 10-foot-tall reeds, the sharp, wet leaves slicing at their hands and faces. They slept in tiny, damp canoes or on patches of soggy ground, their bodies shivering with cold and fever, their ears filled with the constant, maddening hum of mosquitoes. The drenching rain washed the ink from his journal, blurring the precious notes he so carefully kept. His strength failed. The bouts of fever came more and more frequently, each one a violent, body-shaking storm that left him weaker than the last. He would collapse, unable to move, his mind delirious. His faithful Makololo men would stop. They would build a small, makeshift shelter of branches and reeds. They would cover him, protect him, and wait. They would sit in the drenching rain, patient, watchful, guarding the white man who had become their friend. When the fever broke, they would gently lift him, place him in a canoe or on the back of his ox, Sinbad, and the slow, painful journey would resume. They ran out of food. They ate wild honey and roots and whatever the men could hunt. But the land was hungry too. They passed through villages, but the people here were not the generous hosts he had known. They were suspicious, made hostile by the cruelties of the slave trade. Every tribe demanded payment, a hongo, for passing through their land. They demanded cloth, or beads, or gunpowder. David had little to give. He gave his own shirts, his blankets, his supplies, until he had almost nothing left but his instruments, his Bible, and his medicine. He was a beggar, pleading for safe passage, his medical kit his only currency. He was struck with dysentery, a crippling, debilitating sickness that drained the last of his strength. He could no longer sit on his ox. He lay in the bottom of a canoe, so weak he could not lift his head. His vision blurred. He was dying. He knew it. In a rare, clear moment, he looked at his men, at their strong, faithful faces, and he felt a surge of despair. He had led them here, into this watery, green hell, and he was going to die, and they would be lost, 1,000 miles from their home. But God did not let him go. The fever broke, the rains lessened, the ground began to rise, and one day, in May of 1854, after 6 months of unrelenting agony, he smelled it, a new scent on the wind. It was not a smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation. It was the sharp, clean, unmistakable smell of salt. They had reached the ocean. His men carried him the last few miles. He arrived at the Portuguese port of Luanda, on the Atlantic coast, not as a triumphant explorer, but as a living skeleton. He was emaciated, his skin yellowed by fever, his clothes in shreds, his beard matted. He was so weak, he had to be held on his ox. He found the house of the British consul, a man named Edmund Gabriel. He staggered to the door, a tattered, ruined figure, and collapsed. Mr. Gabriel was a man of profound compassion. He saw this broken Englishman, and he did not turn him away. He carried him inside, laid him on a soft, clean bed, and for weeks, he and a Portuguese doctor nursed David back to health. The kindness was overwhelming. For the first time in months, he was safe. He was warm. He was fed. A British naval ship was in the harbor. Its captain, seeing Livingstone's condition, offered him immediate, free passage back to England. It was a temptation beyond all measure. He could go home. He could leave the fever, the rain, the hardship behind. He could see his wife, his precious Mary. He could see his children. He could rest. He walked to the window of the consul's house. He looked out at the harbor, at the tall, proud ship, the symbol of his escape. Then he looked at his men. His 27 Makololo companions were camped outside the city walls, in a land that was strange and terrifying to them. They had trusted him. They had carried him. They had saved his life, time and time again. They were his friends. He had promised their chief, Sekeletu, that he would bring them home. He turned away from the window. He could not go. His integrity was not for sale, not even for the price of his own comfort, his own family, his own life. If he left these men, he would be a liar. He would have broken his word. The name of Christ, the faith he preached, would be a ruin in the hearts of the Makololo. He would have failed. He made his choice. He wrote to the London Missionary Society, telling them he must, in honor, return with my men. He stayed in Luanda for 4 months, his body slowly regaining its strength, his mind sharp, his purpose renewed. He taught his men. He showed them the great ocean, the warships, the trading houses. And then, in September, he turned his back on the sea, on the ships, on England. He turned his face east, and he plunged once more into the heart of the continent to lead his men home. This journey back was different. He was rested, he was resupplied, and his reputation had gone before him. The tribes who had mocked him and threatened him now saw him as a man of honor, a man who kept his word. They welcomed him. They brought him food. He arrived back in Linyanti, the Makololo capital, a year later in September of 1855. He was a hero. He had done the impossible. He had found a path, and he had brought every single man back, safe. He had kept his promise, but his work was not done. The western path was too hard, too long, too riddled with fever. He had to try the eastern path, the path of the Zambezi. After resting, after discovering the thundering smoke of Victoria Falls, he began the final leg, the push to the Indian Ocean. He left the river to bypass the impassable rapids. This too was a land of hunger, a land of fever, a land scarred and depopulated by the slave trade. Finally, on May 20th, 1856, he stumbled out of the coastal swamps at Quelimane in modern-day Mozambique. He looked out and he saw the water, but this was not the Atlantic. This was the Indian Ocean. He was 4,000 miles from where he had begun. He was the first European in history to cross the entire breadth of southern Africa. He had walked from sea to sea. His body was broken, but his spirit was whole. He had found his highway. The unwilling hero, the cheers were as loud as the thundering smoke of the falls, a different kind of roar, a human avalanche of sound that greeted him at the docks, in the streets, in the grand halls of London. In England, He was no longer just David, the missionary. He was Dr. Livingstone, the national hero, the man who had walked out of the blank center of the map. And it made him deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. He had arrived back in London in December of 1856, after an absence of 16 years. The man who returned was not the boy who had left. He was 43 years old, but he looked far older. His body was a thin, frail scaffold, wasted by 30 bouts of fever and dysentery. His face was a mask of leather, burned dark by a foreign sun. His left arm hung limp and useless at his side, the permanent, visible mark of the lion. He was a ruin of a man, but his eyes, deep-set and intense, still held the unquenchable fire. His first journey was not to a palace or to a stage. It was to a small rented room where his family was waiting. This was the reunion he had yearned for, the anchor he had clung to in the fever dreams. He opened the door, and there was Mary, his faithful, resilient Mary, who had waited 5 long years. And there were his children, Agnes, Thomas, and Robert, his eldest, now a boy of 10, who had been a toddler when he left. And there was a new child, Oswell, born after his departure, a son he had never met. They did not rush into his arms. They stared. This strange, gaunt, sun-blackened man was their father. He spoke with a voice they barely remembered, his Scottish burr now thick with African cadences. He tried to embrace them, but his shattered arm made the gesture awkward. It was a moment of profound joy and profound, heartbreaking strangeness. They were his blood, but they were strangers. They had grown up in England. They were proper, pale, English children. He was a man of the African wilderness. He had come home, but he realized in that quiet, aching moment that he was perhaps more of an alien here than he had ever been in a Makololo village. The public, however, had no such reservations. England was hungry for a hero, and David Livingstone was a hero they could understand. He was a man of God. He was a man of science. He was a man of industry, the boy from the cotton mill who had conquered a continent. He was the embodiment of the age. The acclaim was relentless. The Royal Geographical Society, the most esteemed body of explorers in the world, held a grand reception. They had followed his dispatches, his maps, his astronomical readings with breathless excitement. He was not just an adventurer, he was a scientist, a meticulous cartographer who had redrawn the map of a continent. They awarded him their highest honor, the Patron's Gold Medal. He stood before them, not as a polished orator, but as the same blunt, honest man. He spoke not of his own glory, but of the land, of the rivers, of the people, of the vast, open, waiting continent. He was invited to dine with lords and dukes. He was summoned by Queen Victoria herself, a private audience at the palace. He stood before the most powerful woman in the world, a man from a one-room tenement, and he spoke to her with the same simple, direct honesty. He spoke of the beauty of the land and of the shadow that lay upon it. He despised flattery. He hated the fancy dinners, the endless handshaking, the fawning praise. He wrote in his journal that he felt like a performing lion, trotted out for the amusement of the crowds. This, to him, was a more dangerous, suffocating wilderness than the Kalahari. He longed for the silence of the open sky, for the honest conversation of his Makololo friends. But he was a practical man. He saw this unwanted fame not as a reward, but as a tool. It was a platform, a mighty pulpit given to him by God, and he would not waste it. If they wanted to hear him, he would speak. but he would speak the truth that burned in his heart. He retreated from the crowds. He found a quiet set of rooms, and he began to write. He was not a natural author. He wrote as he spoke, with a plain, direct, unadorned honesty. He wrote his missionary travels and researches in South Africa. It was his report, his testimony. He filled it with his scientific observations, his descriptions of botany, of geology, of the intricate cultures of the tribes he had met. He described the lion attack, the journey to Luanda, the thundering smoke of Victoria Falls, but woven through every chapter, the true, steady heartbeat of the book was his moral crusade. He painted a picture of the East African slave trade. He used his calm, measured, doctor's voice to describe a horror that froze the blood. He described the burned villages, the lines of captives in their heavy wooden yokes, the children left to perish on the trail. He called it the open sore of the world. The book was an instant, astonishing success. It sold 70,000 copies, a number almost unimaginable for the time. It made him a wealthy man, but more, it awakened the conscience of a nation. He had given the British public a window into the heart of Africa, and they were horrified by what they saw. He had their attention. Now, he would use it. In December of 1857, he traveled to the University of Cambridge. The Senate House was packed, a sea of students, professors, and dignitaries, all crammed in to see the hero of Africa. When David Livingstone walked onto the stage, a hush fell. He was not an imposing figure. He was the small, weathered man, his left arm pinned to his chest. He spoke, not with polished eloquence, but with a raw, compelling intensity. He did not give them grand tales of adventure. He gave them a burden. He told them of the open road he'd found, a highway for Christianity and commerce. He laid out his divine thesis that legitimate trade in cotton, in ivory, in sugar could and would destroy the slave trade. And then he made his plea. He looked at the young men, the future of England. "I beg to direct your attention to Africa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that in a few years I shall be cut off in that country, which is now open. Do not let it be shut again. I go back to Africa to try to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Do you carry out the work which I have begun? I'll leave it with you." He had found his true voice. He was not the stammering, terrified boy who had fled the pulpit in Chipping Onga. He was a prophet, speaking with the authority of his own scars. He concluded with the words that would echo for each generation, the simple, humble, granite-hard expression of his faith. "I am prepared to go anywhere, provided it goes forward." He had done it. He had turned his fame into a weapon for justice. He was no longer just a humble missionary, dependent on a small society. The British government, moved by his words, by the public outcry his book had created, now saw him as a national asset. They would send him back to Africa, not as a lone wanderer, but as the official head of a grand, government-funded Zambezi expedition. The shadow on the Zambezi. This was not a humble mission. It was a grand government expedition, a flotilla of purpose. He was no longer a lone man in a canoe. He was Her Majesty's consul, with a steamship, a European crew, and the full backing of the British Crown. It should have been a triumph, the grand fulfillment of his Cambridge plea. But from the very moment he arrived, the journey began with the taste of ash. He had returned to the Zambezi Delta in 1858. This time, Mary was with him, His rock, his comfort, his African-born wife had returned from England to stand by his side. His youngest son, Oswell, was with them too. This was to be a new kind of mission, a model of Christianity and commerce. He had scientists, an artist, an engineer, and he had his vessel, the symbol of his entire plan, a steamship. It was a prefabricated, shallow-draft paddle steamer assembled on the coast. In honor of his wife, he had named it the Ma Robert, the Tswana name for Mother of Robert. The name was a prayer, but the ship was a curse. It was a disaster. It had been built of a new, untested steel plating, and it leaked. It leaked constantly. Its engines were weak, barely able to fight the powerful Zambezi current. It consumed a mountainous, impossible amount of firewood, forcing his men to spend more time on the banks with axes than on the deck with maps. This ship, this navigable highway incarnate, was a floating failure, a constant, churning symbol of broken promises. The crew was no better. He was a man who had walked 4,000 miles with a loyal, patient, and trusting Makololo. He was not a man built to manage the egos and complaints of other Europeans. His men bickered. They resented his authority. They sickened with fever and lost their nerve. His own brother, Charles, who had come as his assistant, proved difficult, and a coldness grew between them. David was a peerless pioneer, but he was a poor administrator. He knew how to endure hardship himself, but he did not know how to lead other men through it. He was isolated, a captain on a leaking, mutinous ship. But his faith was in the river. His entire thesis, the promise that had moved a nation, rested on the Zambezi being a navigable highway to the interior. He pushed the Ma Robert upriver, its hull groaning, its engines whining, past the familiar, lower stretches. He came, at last, to the Great Barrier, the rapids he had bypassed on foot years before. He called them the Quebrabassa Rapids. He had come to prove they were navigable. He stood on the bank, and he saw the truth. His heart went cold. These were not rapids. This was a 30-mile-long cataclysm of water. The entire mighty Zambezi, trapped in a narrow granite gorge, became a boiling, thundering, impassable chaos. It was a solid wall of angry water, of whirlpools and rocks, a place no ship, no steam-powered dream could ever conquer. His promise was broken. The thesis of his best-selling book was wrong. The great highway for Christianity and commerce, the road he'd promised at Cambridge, did not exist. It was a lie. He was a failure. A lesser man would have turned back. A lesser man would have admitted defeat. David Livingstone looked at the roaring, mocking water, and he pivoted. His will was made of the same granite as the gorge. If the Zambezi was not the highway, he would find another. God had not brought him this far to abandon him. He turned his attention to a tributary, the Shire River, flowing from the north. It was an unknown river, a blank space on his own map. He was an explorer again, and in this, his spirit was renewed. He pushed his failing steamer up the Shire, fighting its current. He came to another set of impassable cataracts, which he named the Murchison Cataracts. But he would not be stopped. He left the ship. He walked. He and his men pushed overland, and in 1859, they stood on the shore of a vast, magnificent inland sea. It was a shimmering, blue expanse, stretching farther north than the eye could see, surrounded by high, misty mountains. This was Lake Nyasa, what we now call Lake Malawi. He had found a new highway, but this new hope was shadowed by a new horror. This region was the very heart of the East African slave trade. He saw it not as a distant problem, but as a living, breathing nightmare. He saw the Arab dhows, their hulls low in the water, packed with human cargo. He saw the long, tragic lines of captives, yoked together, their villages burning on the shore. This open sore of the world was weeping, and he was a helpless witness. His heart broke for the land, and soon his heart would be broken for himself. Mary, for her health and the safety of her child, had been forced to leave him, to stay with her parents in the south. But she could not bear the separation. In the early 1862, she returned. She was determined to be with him, to share his burden, to make a home for him in the wilderness. She joined him at Shupanga, on the banks of the lower Zambezi. For a few brief weeks, there was a measure of peace. He had his partner by his side. Then she fell ill. It was not a slow decline. It was a sudden, violent, overwhelming attack of malaria. David, the doctor who had nursed hundreds, the man who had survived 30 fevers, was now a desperate, helpless husband. He sat by her bed. He administered the quinine, the medicine he trusted. But the fever did not listen. It raged. It consumed her. He held her hand. He watched the woman who was his anchor, the woman born in this land, the woman who understood his restless soul, slip away from him. On April 27th, 1862, Mary Livingstone died. The man of iron, the will of granite, shattered. He was hollowed out. A numbness of heart, he wrote, settled over him. He walked out into the village, his face a mask of grief, and wept like a child. His men, who had never seen him show such weakness, wept with him. He had faced the lion. He had faced the wilderness. He had faced starvation. But this was an agony that brought him to his knees. They built a simple wooden coffin. They carried her to a high, dry spot, away from the flooding river. They dug a grave in the shade of a single, massive, ancient baobab tree. He, the man of God, read the burial service, his voice breaking. He stood, his son Robert beside him, and he watched them lower his Mary into the red African earth. His heart was buried with her. He carved a simple wooden cross, and he hung it on the great, great trunk of the baobab. The expedition was over, though it would limp on for 2 more agonizing years. His wife was gone. His son Robert, in a storm of grief and teenage rebellion, ran away, booking passage to America to fight and to die in the Civil War. The Ma Robert finally, mercifully, sank. His new ship, the Pioneer, was recalled. In 1864, the British government officially declared the Zambezi expedition a failure. He returned to England, not as a hero, but as a man under a cloud. He was a widower. He was a failed leader. He was a man who had promised a navigable highway to a continent and had found only a dead end, a series of impassable rapids, and a grave. This, by every worldly measure, was the end of his story. The open sore of the world. The smoke was not from a cooking fire. It was the acrid, choking smell of a village burning. The gunshots echoing across the water were not for hunting. They were the flat, sharp sound of slaughter. He had returned to England, a broken man. He was a widower, his heart buried under a baobab tree on the banks of the Zambezi. He was a national failure, the leader of a grand expedition that had cost the government a fortune and had yielded nothing but a grave and a set of impassable rapids. He was in his 50s, his body weakened, his reputation in tatters. By every worldly measure, his work was done. But David Livingstone was not a man who listened to the measures of the world. In the quiet darkness, his mind did not see the mocking crowds or the disappointed politicians. He saw the flicker of the slave coffles. He saw the burned villages on the shores of Lake Nyasa. He saw the faces of the captives. His work was not done. He was haunted by a question, a geographical and spiritual mystery, the source of the Nile. It was the great, unsolved puzzle of the age. But for David, it was more than a puzzle. He believed that the great lakes he had found, Nyasa and the others, were part of a vast continental watershed. He believed that this watershed was not just the source of the Nile. It was the source, the very heart of the East African slave trade. He reasoned that if he could find the true source, if he could map this intricate network of rivers and lakes, he could understand the trade routes, and he could, finally, expose them. He would not be sent by a government, he would be sent by his friends. The Royal Geographical Society, led by his faithful old friend Roderick Murchison, still believed in him. They raised the funds. The mission was simple, almost monastic. He would go back, he would go alone, and he would find the source of the Nile. He landed in Zanzibar in January of 1866. This was not the Africa he had known. This was the eastern coast, the capital of the Arab Sultanate. This was the very heart of the trade he had come to destroy. The city's air was thick with the smell of cloves and with a deeper human misery. He walked through the open-air slave market. He saw men, women, and children chained, inspected like cattle, their eyes hollowed by a despair he could not fathom. This was not a hidden crime happening in the dark interior. It was a public, thriving, accepted commerce. His resolve, already granite, hardened into diamond. He assembled his caravan. There would be no wagons, no steamships. The tsetse fly guarded this land. He would walk. He hired porters, but his true trusted companions were two men who had served him on the failed Zambezi journey. Two men who had proven their loyalty. Their names were Susie and Chuma. They were his anchor, his faithful, quiet shadows. He plunged inland, and his final, greatest journey, his Via Dolorosa, began. This was not an expedition. It was an ordeal. He was older now, and the land was more brutal than any he had ever known. The rains were relentless, turning the footpaths into rivers of thick, grasping mud. The porters he'd hired in Zanzibar, faithless and cruel, began to desert, stealing his supplies, his food, his cloth. And then, the final, fatal blow. A small group of porters deserted in the night. When David awoke, he found they had taken a small, wooden box. It was his medicine chest. It contained all of his quinine, his only defense against the malaria that had stalked him for 20 years. It was a death sentence. He was now a man walking naked into a war. He knew what this meant. He wrote in his journal with a calm, almost detached fatalism. The fevers would return, and they would not be fought. They would only be endured. The fevers came. They struck him, one after another, like blows from a hammer. He would walk, his body on fire, his mind drifting in a hazy, buzzing fog. He would collapse, and Susie and Chuma would build a small grass hut over him. He would lie there, shivering and burning for days, for weeks, until the fever broke, and he would rise, a thinner, weaker ghost, and he would walk again. His body began to break down. The constant wading through swamps brought on new, terrible ailments. His feet became covered in tropical ulcers, open, weeping sores that ate at the flesh. Every step was a white-hot, searing agony. He was no longer an explorer. He was a sufferer. He was a pilgrim, measuring his progress in inches of pain. He vanished from the world. For months, and then for years, no word came. The coast heard only silence. In England, the newspapers wrote his obituary. The world mourned the loss of the great Dr. Livingstone, dead, lost in the heart of Africa he had so loved. But he was not dead. He was alive, kept breathing by the loyalty of Susie and Chuma, and by the sheer, unbending force of his will. He was a skeleton, but he walked. He was passed from village to village, sometimes helped by kind local chiefs, sometimes kept alive by the Arab slave traders themselves, who, in a strange, terrible irony, respected this gaunt, white holy man who walked among them even as he was plotting their destruction. He pushed west. He reached Lake Tanganyika. He pushed further to the Lualaba River, a massive, north-flowing river he believed must be the Nile. He was weak. He was in constant pain, but he had to know. He followed the river to the town of Nyangwe, a major, sprawling Arab settlement, a crossroads of the slave and ivory trades. He was trapped there, too weak to travel, waiting for canoes, for supplies. He was a guest, a witness, a ghost. And on July 15th, 1871, he witnessed the scene that would seal his life's purpose. It was a market day. The town square by the river was crowded. Hundreds of people, mostly women, had come from the surrounding villages to sell their fish, their fruit, their cassava. The air was loud, peaceful, a normal day of commerce. David sat, watching, resting his aching, ruined feet. Suddenly, a dispute broke out, an argument. A shot was fired, and then the world descended into madness. The Arab slavers, led by a trader named Tagamoyo, in a fit of random, pointless rage, opened fire. They raised their rifles and fired, not at an enemy, but into the thick, panicked crowd. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The air was filled with screams, with the flat crack of the rifles. The people, unarmed, terrified, fled. They ran for the only escape route, the wide, brown river. They plunged into the water, a desperate, swimming, thrashing mass. And the slavers, standing on the bank, laughed. They raised their rifles, and they began to hunt. They fired into the water, a sport, as David called it, picking off the screaming, drowning women and children. David was paralyzed. He was one man. He was unarmed. He was sick. He was helpless. He could do nothing but watch. He saw the bodies float past. He saw the river turn red. He saw the inhumanity, the bottomless, casual cruelty. He watched for hours, his heart frozen, his soul seared. 400 people, perhaps 500, were murdered before his eyes. He stumbled back to his hut, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. This was the end of all his questions. The source of the Nile did not matter. The maps did not matter. This horror was the only thing that mattered. He opened his journal. His hand was trembling, but he forced it to be steady. He would be the witness. He described the dreadful scene, the scale or slaughter, the fiendish. He wrote of his own profound sickness of heart. "I am heartsore," he wrote, "and sick of human blood." And then he wrote the words that would become his final, lasting epitaph, the diagnosis of the cancer he'd given his life to expose. He wrote that this trade was the open sore of the world. The quest for the Nile was over. The quest for justice had begun. He turned his face east, his body a ruin, his spirit a righteous burning flame, carrying his journal as a sacred trust, a testimony that he would deliver to the world or die trying. The faithful hearts, the world thought him dead. He was a ghost, a rumor, a name whispered and then dismissed. Emaciated, his feet raw with ulcers, his supplies stolen, he was utterly, painfully alone. But he was not alone. He was kept alive by the steady, quiet, unwavering loyalty of two men, Susie and Chuma. He had turned his back on Nyangwe, his heart scarred by the massacre, his mind seared by the sight of the river running with blood. His quest for the Nile was over, a futile, intellectual game. His new, all-consuming purpose was to be a witness, to carry his journal, this terrible, sacred testimony, to the coast. He had to get the story out. He had to expose the open sore of the world, or die trying. And he was dying. The long walk back, a retreat of hundreds of miles, was an ordeal of pure, unmitigated suffering. The porters he had hired, men who had no loyalty to him, who saw him only as a failing master, had deserted. They had taken everything. They had taken the trade cloth, the food, the beads, and they had taken his medicine box. The quinine, his one thin shield against the fever, was gone. He was a king with no kingdom, a consul with no authority, a doctor with no medicine. He was a beggar in a land that had stripped him bare. He was defenseless, and the fevers, which had always stalked him, now fell upon him like wolves. The bouts came with a new, terrifying regularity. One day, he would be walking, his mind clear, his focus fixed on the eastern horizon. The next, he would be on the ground, his body shaking with a violent, bone-rattling chill, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Then the chill would pass, and the fire would come, a dry, burning internal heat that cooked his brain and sent him into a world of delirious, buzzing nightmares. He would lie in a puddle of his own sweat, muttering, helpless as a child. And in these moments, when he was at his most vulnerable, Susie and Chuma would not leave. They became his hands, his feet, his mind. These were not new companions. They were his faithful men, his friends, his sons in the faith. He had freed them both from slavery years before, on the disastrous Zambezi expedition. He had seen their character, their strength, their integrity. They were not his servants, they were his partners. Abdullah Susi was a man of the river, quiet, observant, and infinitely practical. He was a master builder. When the rains came, a solid grey sheet of water, Susie could, in minutes, build a small, perfect hut, a tent. He would cut saplings, bend them, and thatch a roof of broad leaves and grass, creating a small, dry, safe bubble in the midst of the deluge. James Chuma was younger, a man of the coast, quick-witted, a natural negotiator. Chuma was the quartermaster. He would take the last tiny scraps of cloth and barter in the villages, not with threats, but with respectful diplomacy, returning not with a feast, but with a small handful of grain, a chicken, enough to keep their small, fragile party alive for one more day. They were his guardians. They were the physical presence of God's grace in his life. When he was delirious, they bathed his face with cool water. When he shivered, they covered him with their own bodies. His feet, which had walked a continent, were now his greatest enemy. The constant wading through swamps and flooded rivers had infected them. Tropical ulcers, deep, circular, weeping sores, had eaten into his flesh. Every step was a fresh, white-hot agony. He would bind them in rags, but the rags would soak with blood. He could no longer walk. He would sit by the path, his head in his hands, a man of iron, finally broken by his own frail body. He could not go on. But Susie and Chuma would not leave him. They went into the forest. They cut 2 long, strong poles. They lashed a framework between them and wove a bed of strong, flexible bark. They created a litter, a kitanda. And then these 2 men, their own bodies thin with hunger, their own shoulders aching, lifted their master. They placed him on the litter, and they carried him. For days, for weeks, they carried him. They walked, their bare feet moving in a slow, steady, rhythmic pace, their shoulders bearing the weight of the man who'd come to save their people. The great, white explorer, the man who had discovered lakes and crossed a continent, was now as helpless as the cargo he had come to liberate. He was a passenger, kept alive by the love of the men he'd once set free. Their destination was a point on a map, a name he clung to with a desperate, failing hope: Ujiji. It was a large Arab town on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika. It was a hub of the slave trade, but it was also a post. He knew that, years before, the British consul on the coast had sent supplies for him: food, clothes, letters from home, and medicine, quinine. He reasoned that if he could only reach Ujiji, he could be saved, he could rest, he could heal, he could resupply. The hope for Ujiji was the one thin thread that kept his spirit tethered to his body. He would pray, his voice a dry whisper: "Lord, just get me to Ujiji." In late October 1871, after a journey of 500 agonizing miles, they arrived. Susie and Chuma carried him into the town. The people stopped and stared at the sight: a living skeleton, his face a gaunt, yellowed mask, his eyes burning with a feverish light, carried on the shoulders of his 2 faithful men. They took him to the compound of the Arab trader who was meant to be holding his supplies. He was laid on the ground. He waited, his heart pounding with a fragile, painful hope. The trader came out. He was polite, but his eyes were empty. The supplies? Oh yes, the supplies had come, but that was many months ago. The good doctor was presumed dead. The cloth, the food, the beads, they'd been used, stolen, sold. They were gone. It was the final blow. The thread snapped. He had endured the massacre. He had endured the fevers, the ulcers, the pain, the humiliation of the litter. He had held on to this one single hope. And now it is gone. He was destitute. He was in a hostile town, thousands of miles from the coast, with no medicine, no money, and no food. He was trapped. He was, by every rational measure, a dead man. He sat in the shade of a small hut, his head bowed. He was finished. He had failed. He would die here, in this slave-trading town, and his journal, his testimony, would be buried with him. Susie and Chuma stood by him. They had no words of comfort. They had no grand theological insights. They did not despair. They did not blame him. They did not leave. They simply stayed. Chuma went out to forage, to beg, to find what he could. Susie sat, watchful, his hand on his knife, a silent guardian. Their faithfulness, a loyalty that asked for nothing and gave everything, was the only thing left in the world that was real. It was a mirror of the faithfulness of God, a love that did not falter, even when all hope was gone. He was lost. He was waiting for the end. He was a man with nothing left, sitting in the dust, in the heart of Africa, kept alive only by 2 faithful hearts. The man from New York, he had not seen a white face in years, not a single one. When the man, dressed in a clean tan suit and a white helmet, walked into the center of Ujiji and spoke in a clear American accent, it felt like a dream. The world which had forgotten him, had suddenly, impossibly, walked into his compound? While David Livingstone was a ghost in the interior, a name presumed dead, the world outside was stirring. In Paris, a young, ambitious, and driven journalist named Henry Morton Stanley received a commission. He was summoned by his employer, James Gordon Bennett Jr., the brash, wealthy owner of the New York Herald. Bennett was a man of sensational headlines and grand gestures. He gave Stanley a simple, almost impossible-sounding order: find Livingstone. He did not care about the cost. He did not care about the danger. Draw £1,000, he said. And when that is gone, draw another. And when that is gone, draw another. Find him. Stanley was the perfect man for the job. He was, like Livingstone, a man forged in hardship. A Welsh orphan, he had remade himself in America. He was driven not by a divine call, but by a relentless, burning ambition to make his name, to be the one who solved the mystery. He was practical, he was tough, and he was unstoppable. He arrived in Zanzibar and did not move with a missionary's humility. He moved with the speed and force of a small army. He organized the largest, best equipped, most expensive safari the coast had ever seen. He hired nearly 200 porters. He bought tons of supplies, bolts of fine cloth, coils of thick brass wire, bags of beads. He packed medical supplies, tools, tents, and tins of luxury foods, champagne, and claret. He was not a pioneer, blending in. He was an invasion force determined to buy, bribe, or fight his way to his goal. While Livingstone, sick and destitute, was being carried by Susie and Chuma, surviving on begged handfuls of grain, Stanley was marching inland, a whirlwind of energy. He was hard on his men. He was impatient with the land. He fought his way through hostile tribes, crossed the same swamps, and endured the same fevers. But he was not a man to be stopped by suffering. He was a man driven by a headline. In the town of Ujiji, David Livingstone sat in the shade, a man hollowed by despair. His supplies were gone. His hope was gone. He was trapped. He was waiting to die. He would read his Bible, his one remaining comfort. He would write in his journal, his hand shaking, his testimony complete but undeliverable. On the 10th of November, 1871, Susie ran to him, breathless. Inglesi, an Englishman, was coming. A caravan, large and well-armed, was approaching the town, led by a white man. Livingstone's heart, which he thought was dead, gave a painful, hopeful lurch. He was afraid to believe. He was afraid it was another illusion, another cruel trick of the fever. He was a man of dignity. He would not run. He forced himself to be calm. He had his men straighten his small hut. He put on his last, faded, but clean, consular cap. David Livingstone, Her Majesty's consul, would receive his guest. The caravan entered the town square. It was a spectacle. At its head was the American flag, carried proudly. Behind it marched dozens of armed porters, and then the man himself, Henry Morton Stanley. He was clean. He was healthy. He was a vision from another world. The crowd parted. Stanley saw the small, impossibly gaunt, grey-bearded white man waiting for him. He, too, felt the weight of the moment. This was the climax of his entire agonizing journey. He walked forward, his mind racing. What does one say to a man who's been resurrected from the dead? He took off his helmet. He held out his hand, and with a voice of forced, almost absurd formality, he spoke the words that would echo through history. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? David felt a lifetime of tension release. He managed a small, kind smile. He took the offered hand. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, "and I feel thankful that I'm here to welcome you." The dam of formality broke. The two men stood, hands clasped, in the center of Africa, a world of difference between them, the saint and the seeker, the missionary and the journalist, but united in that one surreal, human moment. This was God's answer. It was the ram in the thicket. It was the ravens in the wilderness. It was a provision sent not from a church, but from a sensational, secular New York newspaper. Stanley, with his boundless energy, took charge. "Unpack the stores," he ordered, and the wealth of the Herald expedition was laid at Livingstone's feet. Bolts of fine cloth, bags of sugar, of coffee, of flour, tins of puddings and jams, and letters, a bag full of letters from home, from his children, news from a world he had not heard from in 6 years. Livingstone wept. He held the letters from his daughter, Agnes, and he wept. He ate. He sat at a table with a plate of real food, and he ate slowly, his starving body relearning what it was to be full. And Stanley brought out his medicine chest. He brought out the quinine. David took the small, bitter pills, and for the first time in years, the fire of the fever in his blood began to cool. But the greatest gift Stanley brought was not food or medicine. It was companionship. It was a new, vibrant, human energy. Livingstone, who had been isolated, alone with his own failing thoughts, now had a partner. He had someone to talk to, someone who understood his world, someone who listened. They were a strange pair. Livingstone, the older, quiet, humble man of God. Stanley, the brash, ambitious, self-made man of the world. But a deep, genuine, and powerful bond formed between them. Stanley, the orphan, saw in Livingstone the father he had never had, a man of quiet, unbending integrity that he had never known. Livingstone, who had lost his own son Robert to war and rebellion, saw in Stanley a spark, a surrogate son, a man of action and will. For 4 months, they lived together in Ujiji. They talked for hours. Livingstone unburdened his heart. He told Stanley of the long, terrible journeys, and he told him of the Nyangwe massacre. He gave his testimony, his open sore of the world, to the one man on earth who could deliver it to the front page of every newspaper. They explored together. Their strength returned, and they took a canoe, and they charted the northern end of Lake Tanganyika, proving, once and for all, that it was not, as some believed, the source of the Nile. It was a final, shared act of discovery. The time came. Stanley's mission was complete. He had found his man. He had his story. He pleaded with David. "Come home," he said. "Come back with me. You are a hero. You have done enough. You are old. You are sick. Let me take you home." David looked at the man who had saved his life. He looked at the supplies, the path to safety. He was grateful, his heart overflowing with thankfulness for this divine rescue. But his work, he felt, was not yet done. Stanley's caravan turned to face the coast, a long, triumphant procession. Livingstone, his health restored, his supplies replenished by his new friend, walked with him for the first few miles, a quiet, final act of fellowship. Then they stopped. They stood on a high ridge, the path to the coast stretching east, the dark, unknown interior stretching west. This was the great, final parting of the ways. Stanley, his eyes filled with a rare, genuine emotion, held out his hand. Livingstone took it. "God guide you," Stanley said. David watched the caravan, the last link to his world, disappear over the horizon. He was alone again, by his own deliberate, agonizing choice. He turned his face from the coast, from home, from safety, and set his gaze, one last time, toward the wilderness. The final watch. The rain fell in solid, relentless sheets at Ailala. He was too weak to walk, so his men built a special litter, a kitanda, and they carried him gently through the swamp. The air was a grey, wet, suffocating blanket. But David knew this was not a journey. This was his final recession. He had walked away from Stanley, from safety, from home, with his supplies replenished and his spirit, for a time, restored. He had turned his face back to the interior, to the vast, watery puzzle, his mind still fixed on that one final question, the source of the Nile. It was an obsession now, a last, fading, intellectual quest. He walked into the swamps of Lake Bangweulu, a region of endless, flooded plains, a land that was more water than earth. But his body, which had been so miraculously restored by Stanley's care, was a ruined, borrowed thing. The strength Stanley had given him was alone, and now it was spent. The fevers returned, not with their old periodic fury, but with a new, final, consuming power, and with them, a new, more terrible enemy. He was struck with severe internal bleeding, a symptom of his chronic untreated dysentery. His last, waning strength poured from him. He could no longer walk. The ulcers on his feet were a secondary pain. He would fall from his donkey, too weak to even sit upright. His will was still granite, but his body was dust. He would lie on the soaked ground, his mind still clear, but his limbs refusing to obey. Susie and Chuma, his faithful hearts, would not leave him. They had not left him in destitution, and they would not leave him in death. They built the litter, they cut the long, strong poles, and they lifted their master. They carried him, step by painful, sucking step, through the great, grey Ilala swamp. The world was a monotonous, bleak landscape of water, mud, and sky. They were a tiny, slow-moving island of loyalty, carrying their dying king. He was in constant, quiet agony, but he was an explorer to the last. He would rouse himself, his voice a dry whisper, and ask Susie to hold his compass. "Which way are we?" he would ask. He would ask about the flow of the water, the height of the land, his mind still charting, still mapping, still seeking. In late April 1873, they arrived at a small remote village in the district of Ilala. The chief, Chitambo, saw the gaunt, dying man, and he was moved with compassion. He offered his own large hut, the best in the village. Susie and Chuma, with their builder's skill, declined. They would not dishonor the chief. In the center of the village, they built a new, clean hut for their master. They built it in the traditional way, with a high, thatched roof and mud-plastered walls. They built a tent inside it, a small, private room, and they built him a bed, a raised platform of wood and grass, to keep him off the cold, damp earth. They carried him inside. His long journey was over. He knew it. He was grateful. He was calm. He lay on the simple bed, the sound of the rain drumming on the thatched roof. His men were near. He was not alone. He asked for his journal. He asked for his pen. His hand was trembling so violently, he could barely form the letters. He continued to write. He noted his position. He wrote of the rain. His last entry, on April 27th, was a testament to his broken body. "Knocked up quite," he wrote, "and remain, recovering, sent to buy milch goats. We are on the banks of the Molilamo." His mind was clear, but the end was near. On the evening of April 30th, he called Susie to his side. His voice was barely a whisper. "Wind my watch," he said. Susie carefully took the timepiece, the small ticking engine of the outside world, and wound it. David then asked for his medicine box. He fumbled, and Susie, seeing his master's weakness, helped him. David selected a dose of calomel. "All right now," he whispered. "You may go." Susie and Chuma and his small, faithful band of followers sat outside the hut in the rain. They kept the fire high. They spoke in low, hushed tones. They were on the final watch. A few hours later, in the deep, pre-dawn darkness, he called out. His voice was a little stronger. "Majwara," he called to his young personal attendant. "Come." Majwara went in. David asked for water. Majwara held the cup to his lips. He drank. "Go," he said. "All right now." The men sat by the fire, listening. The rain had softened. The village was wrapped in a profound, heavy silence. An hour passed, and then another. The hut was too quiet. At around 4 a.m, a terrible, unspoken dread settled on Susie. He sent Majwara back in. The boy went to the doorway and froze. He came running back out, his voice choked with terror and grief. Bwana is dead." Susie and Chuma took a lighted branch from the fire. They pushed aside the reed mat that served as a door. They stepped into the small, dark room. David Livingstone was not in his bed. He was kneeling beside his bed. His body was slumped forward. His head was resting on the pillow. His hands clasped together, buried in the bedding, as if in a final, fervent plea. He was in the unmistakable, fixed posture of prayer. He had not died in a fever dream. He had not died in despair. Alone on the cold ground, he had, in his last, final moments, gathered the remnant of his strength. He had lifted his broken body from his bed, and he knelt. He had finished his course, not as an explorer, not as a hero, but as a humble servant, on his knees, in the middle of a quiet conversation with his God. A great, wailing cry rose from his men. The village awoke. The sound of their grief echoed through the grey morning mist. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of their final, greatest act of love. His men gathered in the center of the village. They held a solemn council, an itala. They were alone, 1,500 miles from the coast, in a land of superstition, with the body of their master. The easy, logical thing to do was to bury him here, under a tree. They could take his precious journals, his last testimony, and make their own safe way to the coast. But Susie and Chuma knew this man. They knew what he represented. They knew his body, the ruined, scarred vessel of his unbending will, was a testament. It was a story. It belonged to the world. They made a vow. They would carry him home. They came to Chief Chitambo and made their request. They asked for a private, fenced enclosure. They asked for salt. They asked for time. They began the long, patient, gruesome task. With a surgeon's care, they made a small, clean incision. They removed his heart and all his internal organs. They buried them reverently in a sealed metal box beneath the spreading branches of a great mvula tree. This was their profound theological statement. His body, his fame, belonged to England, but his heart, the heart that had broken for this land, the heart that had so deeply loved its people, his heart would remain forever in the soil of Africa. For 14 days, they dried his body in the hot African sun, guarding it, turning it, packing it with salt, until it was as hard and as light as a wood. They wrapped it in calico, then in a cylinder of bark. They disguised it as a bale of trade goods, a silent, secret cargo. They carefully, reverently packed his journals, his maps, his instruments, and then they began to walk. For 9 months, Susie and Chuma led their small funereal procession. They carried their master 1,500 miles. They faced hostile tribes who saw their cargo as a source of bad magic. They faced disease, hunger, and desertion. But they did not falter. They carried their vow and his body all the way to the Indian Ocean. At Bagamoyo, they found a British ship. They delivered their master and his last world-changing testimony. When the news reached England, it was not of a failed explorer, but of a martyred saint. The story of his death, on his knees, and the story of his men's unbreakable loyalty ignited the world's imagination. His body was brought to London. It was laid in the rooms of the Royal Geographical Society. A doctor, his old dear friend, was asked to identify the remains. He looked at the withered left arm, and he found the unmistakable, poorly healed fracture, the mark of the lion. "It is he," the doctor said, and wept. On a grey April day in 1874, the streets of London were silent. A procession, followed by a weeping, grateful nation, carried him to his final rest. The boy from the Blantyre cotton mill, the man from the one-room tenement, was buried in the central nave of Westminster Abbey, laid to rest among the kings, the poets, and the prophets of his nation. His journal was published. The story of the Nyangwe massacre, his open sore of the world, was read by Parliament, by the Queen, by the people. It was a testimony that could not be ignored. It lit a fire of abolition that would not be quenched. His life and his death had achieved what his expedition had failed to do. He had opened the heart of a continent, not with a steamship, but with his sacrifice. His body was in England, his heart was in Africa, but his soul was and is with his God. His body rests in stone, in the heart of an empire, beneath the floor of a great abbey. He is surrounded by the dust of kings, of poets, of scientists. The sound of his final resting place is the echo of footsteps, the murmur of tourists, the distant, angelic rise of a choir. It is a place of honor. It is a place of history. It is a place of fame. But his heart is elsewhere. His heart is in Africa. It is buried in the red earth, beneath the vast, spreading branches of a mvula tree. Its only marker is a simple carving. Its only visitors the wind, and the animals, and the people he loved. Its only sound is the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, the deep, ancient silence of the continent that claimed him. This is the story of David Livingstone, a life of 2 burials, a body given to the world, a heart given to his calling, a man who began in the thunder of a factory and who found his final peace in the posture of prayer. As we settle into the quiet of this moment, let the story of his life be a gentle, soothing balm. Let it remind us of a God who does not look for the polished or the perfect or the prepared. He looks for the willing. Think of the boy, small and weary, his hands stained with oil, his ears ringing with the crash and clatter of the spinning jenny. A 14-hour day of relentless, deafening toil. And yet, in the dim, flickering gaslight, he propped a book. His body was a captive of the mill, but his mind was a student. His heart was a seeker. God does not wait for us to be in a quiet chapel to call us. He whispers in the very centers of the noise. He plants a seed of holy purpose in the most unlikely, compacted, and barren ground. That seed grew. It grew into a man who was not an orator, a man who failed his first sermon, who fled the pulpit in shame, his mind blank, his hopes in ruins. But the God who called him was not looking for a silver-tongued speaker. He was looking for a pioneer. He was looking for a man who could walk. He was looking for a man who could endure. Let your own heart be at peace, knowing that your perceived failures, your moments of forgetting, your public stumbles are not a disqualification. They are, perhaps, the very chisel God uses to shape you for your true purpose. The world may look for eloquence, but God looks for a heart that is faithful. Think of the man, his arm shattered, the bone crushed into splinters by the jaws of a lion. He was marked. He was, by any measure, broken. The wound he carried was a source of constant, nagging pain, a symbol of his human fragility. And yet, that very mark became his seal. That wound, which should have been a source of fear, became the foundation of his courage. He had been in the lion's mouth, and God had delivered him. He carried his weakness, not as a source of shame, but as a constant, physical reminder of the strength of his Savior. As you rest, let go of the things that have marked you, the wounds that ache, the failures that define you. God does not discard the broken tool. He consecrates it. He uses the scarred hand. He finds his greatest strength in our deepest, most admitted weakness. Think of the river, the mighty Zambezi, his dream, his promise, his highway for the gospel. He had told the world, this was the path, this was the road God had made. And he came to the rapids at Kebrabassa, and the river was not a highway. It was a barrier. It was a churning, mocking, impassable wall of granite and foam. His promise was a lie. His expedition was a failure. And his Mary, his anchor, his heart, the one who knew his soul, was taken from him. He was a widower in a land of failure, his heart buried under a baobab tree. He was a man with no path and no partner. But God's plan is not the river we see. His highway is not the one we map. God's path for David was not the easy, navigable water. It was the path of suffering. It was the path of loss. It was the path that would break his heart and forge his true, final, and eternal purpose. Let your own heart rest in this truth. The blocked paths in your life, the doors that have been slammed shut, the dreams that have become a dead end, are not a sign of God's absence. They're a sign of his redirection. He is turning you from the river you have chosen to the ocean he has prepared. He is leading you, not around your sorrow, but directly through it, to a place of deeper faith and a purpose you cannot yet imagine. Think of the man destitute at Ujiji. The world thought him dead. His supplies were gone. His medicine was stolen. His body was a ruin. He was a beggar, kept alive by the grace of the very men he had come to preach against. He was a man with nothing. He was a failure, trapped, waiting to die. And God sent him a friend. God sent not a missionary, not a pastor, but a brash, ambitious journalist from New York, a man driven by a headline. God's provision does not always look as we expect. It does not always come from the sources we deem holy. He can send a raven. He can send a newspaper. He can send a stranger. He will not abandon you. When you are at your lowest, when you are most convinced you are forgotten, he is already marching a caravan of provision toward you. He is already on his way. And so, his life was saved. But he did not take the path to safety. He did not go home. He turned his face one last time to the interior. He walked back into the swamp, back into the fever, back into the pain. He was driven not by a quest for a map, but by a righteous, burning fire. He had seen the open sore of the world. He had seen the massacre at Nyangwe, the river running with blood. and he could not be silent. He would be the witness. His final journey was a testament, not of strength, but of loyalty, the loyalty of Susie and Chuma. These faithful African hearts, these men who were his brothers, who would not leave their master. They carried him when he could not walk. They built him a hut when he could not stand. They were the physical, walking, breathing presence of God's love, a love that would not let him go, a love that would carry him home. And in that final, quiet moment, in a small mud hut in the center of a continent, with the rain falling on the thatch, his journey ended. He was not on a stage. He was not in a palace. He gathered the last fading embers of his strength, and he lifted his broken body from his bed. He knelt. His life, which began in the noise of a factory, ended in the silence of a prayer. His life, which was a story of constant forward motion, ended in a posture of complete, still, and perfect surrender. This is the peace that is available to you now. The story of David Livingstone is not a story about a great man. It is a story about a great God. It is a story of a God who is faithful, a God who uses the small, the broken, the failed, and the weak, a God who finishes the work he starts. As you lie here, in the quiet, in the darkness, let the posture of your own rest be a prayer. Let it be an act of surrender. You do not need to strive. You do not need to fight. You do not need to find your own way through the swamp. You are held, you are carried, you are loved. Let the story of his life wash over you like a gentle, cleansing water. Let the noise of your day, the clatter of your own spinning jenny, fade into the distance. Let the anxieties of tomorrow, the impassable rapids you see on your own map, be still. God is the master of the rapids. He is the master of the river. Let the aches of your body, the memory of your own lion's mark, be a reminder, not of your weakness, but of his strength. You are his, and he is yours. Feel the tension leave your shoulders. Feel the weight lift from your heart. You're not at Ujiji, destitute and alone. Your provision is on its way. You're not in the swamp, lost and dying. You're being carried. Let your breathing slow. Let it become a quiet, steady rhythm, like the sound of paddles on a wide, calm river. Breathe in peace. Breathe out the noise. Breathe in God's faithfulness. Breathe out your own striving. His body is in the stone. His heart is in the earth. But his soul is with his Father. And you, in this moment, can rest in the same loving, eternal hands. The watch has been wound. The work is done. All is right, and you can rest. Sleep now. Sleep in peace. God is with you. He is your faithful heart. He is your final watch. As you drift into this deep, healing rest, know that we are grateful to have shared this story with you. These stories of faith, of perseverance, and of God's incredible grace are a comfort, and we are honored to bring them to you. If this story of David Livingstone has brought you peace, if it has been a balm to your heart and a comfort to your mind, we would humbly ask you to help us share this peace with others. The simplest way is to subscribe to our channel. It is a small act, but it allows these stories to reach others who may be in a sleepless, anxious, or difficult place. And if you know someone, a friend or a loved one, who is walking through their own wilderness, who is facing their own impassable river, or who simply needs the gift of a deep and peaceful rest, please share the story with them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for resting with us. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you, and may he give you tonight and always His perfect peace. Good night.